Hello, my name is Stephen Lacey. I'm ex-parish councillor of the Rockall Cathedral in London, ex-parish councillor of the Soros Cathedral in London, where I was involved in the 2006 split, which caused a lot of devastation to people's lives and was probably, in hindsight, the start of quite a destructive policy that has been done by the Kremlin Orthodox Church. You'll notice I won't use the word Russian Orthodoxy Church. I love Russian Orthodoxy, but I do oppose the Kremlin Orthodoxy and the narratives, especially its new interpretation of the Russian world. And the Russian world is a big term and a big terminology, and big terminologies really, really scare me. So we'll talk about how it's kind of morphed later. At times I will talk about the kind of I, which seems really, really kind of self-centered, and I apologise for that in advance. Please forgive me. I do that just to kind of tell the narratives and why I oppose this regime so kind of strongly, why I really, really strongly oppose the full invasion of kind of Ukraine. It's an invasion that's devastated the lives of me and my friends. I have many friends in East Ukraine. Some used to have more kind of very kind of Russian views, some didn't, but they are all now very, very united under kind of Ukraine because of the devastation. These people have often lost their kind of lives, they've lost their homes. Some, I don't know if their families are alive. So it's important to speak up because I live in the UK and I live in comfort. So I want to be a voice in opposition of what I condemn as being kind of wrong. Recently, Sister Vasa, who is very much a voice of reason, had spoken very, very kind of courageously against the invasion of kind of Ukraine by kind of Russia. And her viewpoints were very, very strong and very, very powerful, and in my opinion, incredibly kind of correct. This has been followed up by a number of articles by Father John Whiteford, who is a Rockall priest and someone I listen to in some ways kind of respect. But I feel I have to speak out because I'm a strategist and qualitative researcher, and I do a lot of work in the extremism space, including Islamic extremism and the far right. And for this reason, I think some of the narratives are not kind of correct. There are also narratives that I'm seeing appear a lot in social media kind of space. So this idea of Ukraine, Russia, Belarus being one nation, this idea of Ukraine was complicit with the Nazis and the kind of SS. This whole idea about what about the other wars that America have caused around the world? What about the genocide, an awful genocide of Christians in the Middle East? You don't know what you're talking about because the media is biased, and in the West we're being kind of brainwashed. We're only getting one kind of narrative. The responsibility of the US for the Orange Revolution and 2014 coups. Crimea was legitimate. It was a legitimate thing. Everyone wanted to raise the flag and wanted to be part of the kind of Russian kind of world, similar to the kind of Donbass. The magical 14,000 figure of awful deaths, which comes from Ukrainian kind of data of people that have died in the conflict in the Donetsk and region, Lugansk kind of region. This is often shown in Russian media. Kiev has killed 14,000 people. This idea that the sanctions will cripple the US economy and impact on the poor. The classic bogeyman, far-right kind of narratives. Azov, the terrible Azov that's kind of come through, and the complicity of the Nazi Ukrainian kind of state. This idea that if we want to watch one narrative, we need to all watch Oliver Stone's films, and then the truth will kind of emerge. And lastly, most importantly, the whole kind of concept of the kind of Russian world, and what does that kind of mean? And this is an attack on Russia, an attack on Putin is an attack on kind of Russia. The idea of Zelensky as well is some kind of puppet. So some of these kind of narratives I kind of want to push back on a little bit and kind of challenge them and challenge them hopefully quite kind of rationally, because I think it's important to talk about how these narratives are kind of playing out, because the narratives I'm seeing a lot of Protestant converts adopt, and seeing some with more kind of pro-Russian viewpoints adopt as well. I think before we talk about narratives, let's talk about what kind of unites us. And I think the concept of the war as a sin is something that I kind of strongly agree with. And I pray for the suffering, and I'm sure Father John, you do, and I know most people in the church do, and that is such a correct and right thing to kind of do. This is terrible, and hopefully the saints will answer the prayers. So my views on Father John Whitefoot, I don't know you, Father John, but I know of you. And I like you because I see the church as being very, very broad. In Seraphim Rose, we talk about it. It's a broad church with a liberal wing, which I listen to, and a super correct wing, which I listen to. And somewhere in between, there is kind of the royal kind of path. So I think it's important to listen to different kind of perspectives. The church is also really, really broad in terms of parish. And you're correct very much to kind of talk about that within the parish. And we see it in the parishes that I know. There's different kind of points of view and different kind of perspectives and sadly different kind of debates and different kind of agreements. And I really like the fact that Rockwell is listening to its parish and in a way maybe adopting a more democratic kind of approach. But I don't think that's the right approach for this for the right time. I think there are innocents being killed, and I think it's important that people kind of lead their kind of flock and kind of speak out. Because sometimes we should, and I believe the basis of friendship is sometimes to be a critical friend. And I think it's important for the church and the hierarchy to be that critical friend, especially when we're faced with kind of injustice. Also, I want to caveat that this is not anti-corruption, and that's really, really important because I'm seeing this kind of lie being kind of propagated through certain kind of media kind of channels that any attack on Putin is an attack on Russia. Russia is not a united country. There's lots of people with different kind of viewpoints, and I have a deep love for Russia. Went there for 1989 and fell in love with the country, fell in love with the history, but fell in love with the culture, and I feel very, very deep love for that. Also a deep love for Russian Orthodoxy. I don't have deep love for Kremlin Orthodoxy. It's very, very kind of different. So I think it's important to pull these different kind of elements apart. These divisions are very, very sad, and you're seeing it in Russia where families don't even believe their families in Ukraine are being attacked, and that's really sad. You may call me a liberal, but I am a strong believer in kind of democracy. I believe that's the greatest form of kind of governance. But I respect people that have different kind of viewpoints around that. And I know a number of people within the Orthodox Church believe in autocracy. They believe in this idea of kind of a firm kind of hand, which is an interesting perspective. But if we take that to the logic of kind of Orthodoxy, and we take that to Byzantine, which is in many ways kind of heartland of kind of Orthodoxy, the emperors were only fit to wear the purple while they were fit to wear the purple. So if they were corrupt, or if they led their country into unnecessary kind of wars or spilled too much bloodshed, then they had the right to be deposed. And I believe the Putin regime has reached that stage. It has the right and needs to be kind of deposed. You talk about binaries, and totally agree that the world has fallen into kind of binary kind of positionings. And we have polarity society. So whether that's in the UK, we have Brexit versus Remain, whether that's masks versus kind of anti-masks, whether that's meat eaters, vegetarianism, Democrats versus Republicans, we're divided. And that's a real shame because we should be looking more for kind of unification. I also believe that arguments are often quite simplistic, and simplistic arguments are often thrown out into the media space as a fact of kind of truth. Unfortunately, and please forgive me, but I don't know if you did it just to put over the other point of view, which is admirable to a degree. But I did find your arguments a little bit kind of simplistic. So if we start first with history, and I'm not a historian, and I think we could debate the history of Ukraine for many years, but the concept of nation states is quite new. So countries are developing, they're forming, and they're changing. And in the night, I do love Ukrainian history, but I'm an armchair historian. But even if you look to kind of Galicia, in the 19th century, you had different points of view. You had a more pro-Russian point of view, and you had a more Ukrainian kind of point of view. So this cleavage has kind of existed for quite a long time within Ukrainian kind of society. And sometimes in you need major events, sadly, to kind of unify a country. And that's one thing that I've seen. So every person I know in the East now has a strong sense of Ukrainian kind of nationhood, because they've been attacked, and they've been attacked by a Putin regime that's acted very much as the kind of bully. I was surprised you didn't talk about Russianworld's history. I mean, there's a history of refugees, and was there 1.5 million, less than there is coming from Ukraine at the moment, and that kind of embodiment of a voice against kind of opposition, a voice against totalitarian, and in some ways Paris did as well. So you had the traditional and the liberal branch both having that voice against kind of totalitarian kind of states. And I think that's very, very important. You talked about the Nazis and the SS and Nazis and kind of Ukraine through kind of history, but it's interesting, you actually failed to talk about the whites, and not all the whites, but some of the whites' cooperation with the kind of Nazi kind of state. But in the kind of tradition of kind of Rocco, I think it's important that we speak up against kind of opposition. You talked about media bias, and I've worked a lot in the media space, and I think it's an interesting perspective. Sometimes there are kind of narratives that kind of come through and kind of transcend. But the interesting thing, unlike under the Putin regime, is that we can call it out. So they don't run with a story if they know that story is a lie. So the story in Donetsk of the 4 American soldiers that raped someone, and there's endless kind of stories of crucified boy. They'll run with that story even though they know it's a lie. The Western media will call it out, and we've seen that at the moment, that the Western media has been calling out narratives that they found out that were not kind of true. So I think that's a big difference. I think also, and this is where I slightly disagree with Sister Bassett on fully kind of respect, I think we focus a lot on TV as the kind of bedrock of kind of media and how we get our information. But actually, most people are getting it from echo chambers through kind of social media. And you can see a lot of the Russian narratives. At first, they weren't there, and the let's call it pro-Putin narratives, not Russian narratives. Those narratives weren't really there and strong, and now they're really, really strong. So if you put in 14,000 and Donetsk, for instance, and the conflict or the war that's gone on for kind of 8 years, you get lots and lots and lots of Russian kind of perspectives on that, and very little on the other side. And this is important because political strategists for a number of years have understood the power of kind of social media. I mean, the Brexit campaign was led around that, and some of the campaigns, political campaigns in America, have had a strong social media kind of impact because they know that kind of works. So as we have more distrust for traditional kind of media, we go more into kind of social media. So it's interesting in terms of the war and the what about this war, what about that war, and I condemn all war. So I think it's wrong. But you failed to call out kind of Putin and what he's done in Syria or Central Africa or in Georgia, or the soft power in Moldova, where it's controlling 78% of the kind of banking system, or it's kind of slight, debatable kind of takeover of kind of Belarus. Then you talk, and I see this narrative used quite a lot about the kind of Christians in kind of Syria, and it's awful. It's a genocide, yeah. So and it's called out by genocide. It's been called out by America as genocide. It's been called out also by the EU as a kind of genocide. And the invasion, I'm not a historian on the Middle East, the invasion would have had a kind of impact. But the people aren't fleeing American guns, they're fleeing Islamic extremist guns. And I think that's a kind of a big kind of difference. And I think to put that on the whole of door of the American state is a little bit probably simplistic and naive. It's a little bit like blaming Russia for the Armenian kind of genocide. When we come to the coups, I mean, I'm not privy to kind of American sensitive kind of information, but let's look at the other kind of side. So It's often talked about that America was involved in the coups, but in 2006 and 2014, political technocrats from kind of Russia were flooding the kind of country. You had the oligarch clans, which you didn't touch on, which has actually split and taken different sides at different kind of times, often sometimes taking Russian money, sometimes taking money from other kind of people. And the Putin regime spent millions on propaganda and the creation also of kind of fake parties. So I think we have to be careful about where that responsibility kind of lies. We talk about Crimea, and I've been to Crimea a couple of times. So I love Crimea and this wish that they all wanted to be kind of independent. What's interesting is that they voted to be part of Ukraine, not massively, but they did vote to be kind of Ukraine when after the fall of the Soviet Union. What I think is more interesting is when you look at actually the polling. So a week before the little green men kind of went into Crimea, only 41% wanted to be part of Russia, which is not a kind of minority. You also had the high turnout. What was it, 90% wanted to be part of Russia, but that's just impractical and it just can't happen like that because you've got the Crimean Tatars, you've got the Ukrainian voices. So where were those kind of voices? We also need to look at the pro-Russian parties, and the pro-Russian parties who wanted unification, they only had 9% of max ever in kind of Crimea. So they're small parties, they're minority parties, really, really tiny and very, very insignificant. They've been elevated up and often have massive connections. I mean, the Goblin is kind of well known. And also, it's interesting you didn't talk about the Chechen mafia and how they've moved into Crimea. When we talk about the East is a different kind of histories and different kind of narratives. Again, they voted quite strongly actually in the breakup of the Soviet Union to be part of kind of Ukraine. Before all the wars happened in kind of Donetsk and the Lugansk kind of region and the war caused by kind of Russia, 70% wanted to be part of Ukraine, and only 20% wanted to be part of Russia. So, and the pro-Russian parties there were really, really insignificant and really, really small. And I know you talk sometimes about kind of minority voices and elevating them into the kind of mainstream as a kind of narrative of kind of everyone. I think in many ways that's what's happened in kind of Donetsk. So we've taken a very, very small minority perspective. And we've elevated that through Russian kind of proxies and Russian information as the voice of the kind of East, which it's not. 14,000 people have been arrested for opposing the kind of Kremlin and the Kremlin's kind of position. And 14,000 is an interesting number. In the whole of the Afghan war, 14,000 soldiers, well, just over 14,000 soldiers, Russian soldiers were killed. And there's this magic number that's appearing a lot in the media, which is 14,000. And you see the headlines, Sputnik's done it a lot. Kiev kills 14,000 people. But those figures are from Ukraine. They don't include, people don't talk about the 4,000 Ukrainian soldiers that were killed. They don't talk about the deaths in other kind of regions, such as kind of Mariupol. They don't include the Dutch airline that was shot down. They don't include the people that have been starved. They don't include the landmines. And it's interesting you didn't talk about the anti-war protests within the rebel kind of regions. And it would have been interesting to kind of talk about those, about the areas that have been under kind of Russian kind of control, because there was a number of kind of protests. And what were they protesting about? They were protesting about the fact that the residential areas that Donetsk was actually firing, the Donetsk army was actually firing from residential areas, so that Ukraine would fire rockets into those kind of areas. Awful war, and all loss of life is terrible. Civilian deaths have actually fallen from I think 30% at the beginning of the war to 11%, still too kind of high. You're also interested, you didn't talk about internment camps there, because that would have been an interesting element, or the fact that the businesses have to give money to the Donetsk kind of and Lugansk kind of army. I want to give you a quote from someone called Max Clark. So this is only kind of quotation I'm going to do. So Max Clark is at the moment, he's in Donetsk. He's working with Graham Phillips, who is often called a pro-Russian agent. And I know for a fact that he received money from the Russian state, but that's for a different narrative and a completely different time. So he went to kind of Donetsk, and he's there at the moment talking about the genocide. And he said, in his Facebook post, with a nice picture of people sitting on a beach having beers, stating the obvious, but I feel it worth a reminder: Donetsk isn't a war zone or news piece. It's a city, and a great one at that. So this is a country that's going to be in genocide, constantly shelling, and one of the main propagators of this kind of narrative on his social media posts has a different kind of viewpoint. You talked about poverty and how American sanctions are going to hit Americans. My understanding is that America doesn't really rely very much on trade with Russia and has reduced that. I could be wrong, and you can correct me, please do, if I'm not. But what worries me the most is the impact on the third world, because most of the third world relies on Ukrainian kind of grain. So the starvation levels are going to be absolutely kind of high. You talk about kind of Zelensky, but you failed to mention that he was voted by population by 70%, which is kind of similar to sometimes what Putin's numbers, but in much more kind of democratic and free kind of system. You talked about the Israel connection. I didn't really understand that, but it has the fourth largest number of Jewish people in kind of Europe. So I don't know if that was an indication about kind of some kind of Masonic plot. I'm sure it wasn't, but sometimes you do hear that kind of propagate through. Let's talk about Azov. Azov is evil, right? So parts of Azov are evil. Let's rephrase that. So Azov is quite small, and the estimates from experts in far right put it the far right element is between 10 to 20%. So you're looking at kind of 300 people. But also Azov has sometimes been used by the Putin government and Putin oligarchs. So one of the key kind of oligarchs whose daughter is godfather is Putin, recently used Azov to protect his media interests and his TV stations, pro-Russian TV stations. So I think it's interesting itself, worth kind of mentioning. We also failed to talk about kind of the funding of the far right by Putin and Putin kind of oligarchs within kind of Ukraine, often used as kind of fake parties. But I think it's important to talk about that as well. Also, Putin and the Kremlin regime have funded some of most of the far right parties in the kind of UK, and in many ways they caused the immigration crisis. And Lukashenko's done the same, where they've been pushing immigrants into Europe to try and rise up the kind of far right. So it's kind of to destabilize kind of Europe. Then we can look at kind of Alexander Dugin, kind of translator, who's married to one of the most notorious far right people in the US, or even Graham Phillips' kind of connections with the hard far right in the UK. Graham Phillips is a propagator for a lot of these kind of myths. I think most interesting is Alexander Dugin. So he developed the concept, or took on the old concept of Nova Russia and New Russia and propagated that forward. And he's also often seen as the architect of the Russian world where it is now. And I think that's important, or the Kremlin world. Let's call it the Kremlin world, because I don't like the Russian world, so forgive me for that. And the new kind of Kremlin world is quite different to kind of 2000s and the kind of social contract. If not, a lot of people at that time would have embodied that kind of concept of the Russian world, but it's kind of changed and kind of evolved. But let's look at the architect, the founder of kind of this kind of philosophy. So Alexander Dugin, a Vola's translator, worth googling Avola. He's the architect of the far right narratives and worshipped as the far right kind of narratives. He brought Golden Dawn and numerous far right parties into kind of Russia. Even for Le Pen, he's kind of too kind of moderate, and he had really strong kind of connections with the ultra far right in kind of France. He was part of a small circle called Yuzinki Circle. I think that's probably badly correct, where they used to call the leader the Führer and dressing in third right kind of clothes. He's also a strong believer, although he says he's an old believer, that he believes, and it's well documented that he believes in neo-paganism. He's been part of kind of Kabbalah as well, and even the kind of cult. His publishers, Optos, will have quite strong links to Hare Krishna, And he is a traditionalist, and not traditionalist in family values kind of sense, but a traditionalist as a kind of philosophy. And that philosophy believes that ultimately we have to go through darkness and destruction in order to go back to light. So we can go back to a priest class. Not really that kind of orthodox. And I think that's one of the things that I really strongly condemn, this kind of emergence of this philosophy and how it's merged with kind of Kremlin kind of orthodoxy. One of the things that's often talked about is the Kremlin orthodoxy and kind of family kind of values, but I've never heard anyone talking about Putin and being divorced, or many members of the cabinet and their numerous kind of affairs. What I do know is that this Kremlin world, this Kremlin orthodoxy has created a massive destruction on society. And I think it's easy to kind of blame kind of the minority and play the kind of minority cards, classic kind of far right kind of tactic, but doesn't power and lack of love, bribery and corruption cause massive kind of disruptions? So a lot of the narratives you talk about I find really interesting in the sense that I used to believe them and I used to lap them up. So especially in 2014, I believed in the bipolar world, I believed in NATO encirclement, I believed in the other war, I believed America was evil, I believed in kind of Azov. And I've been quoted as by Khodorkovsky's magazine as a Kremlin kind of propagandist. And also I was a keyboard kind of warrior at the time and often debating people like Edward Lucas. What kind of changed me was the work I did after, around 2016, around kind of extremism, and I kind of looked at far right narratives. And then I could see how these narratives actually merge with Kremlin kind of orthodoxy and the Kremlin kind of world, or the Rusky world, but it's not the Rusky world, it's the Kremlin kind of world. And that whole kind of cult of the kind of strong leader, that idea of countries being good and kind of evil, this idea of a future that's bright based on a kind of mystical past, this idea of a specialness of one or a number of kind of nations kind of coming together, this messianism that kind of third reign was kind of rising, this constant othering of kind of others. So what I observed from there, both from the far right and actually a little bit from the kind of the far right Muslim world or Islamic kind of world, was really strong kind of similarities, and these similarities poison people's minds. These narratives create doubt. These narratives move away from love. These narratives move away from care. These narratives create destruction, and they feed people in a very negative sense. So that's kind of my viewpoint on quite a lot of the narratives you've talked about, but I don't really want to go into the playground about who caused kind of what. There's one really clear thing, and that clear thing is that Putin and the Kremlin threw the first punch, and they caused massive destruction, and people have had to leave their homes just in their suitcases, and people don't know are being starved to death. People are dying. People are being indiscriminately kind of bombed. So I don't think the political framework is necessarily the answers. I think this is about kind of humanity and calling out people that are suffering in fear, calling out those the innocents that are being kind of destroyed, playing and countering those that kind of creating kind of fear narratives, having empathy and love and care for those that are kind of suffering. And the Kremlin and Kremlin orthodoxy has been part of that, and it's been a vehicle for that for many years. And it's really interesting that some of the old guard that have been within that kind of narrative for many years are kind of calling it out and kind of saying that essentially that it is wrong. So Metropolitan Inokenti is a classic example. Metropolitan Onofre. And even if we kind of follow the narratives that you've played, because I know you have the recommended Oliver Stone, even Oliver Stone's kind of condemned it. So I think it's really important to call this out. This is a medieval invasion, a cruel invasion, an awful invasion that has caused misery and destruction in people's lives. And lastly, let's pray. Let's pray for those that have been suffering and those that have had their lives destroyed. Thank you for listening.